Admiral Jack Morrison stood on the bridge of the Valiant Dawn and watched the stars bend around his flagship as it tore through space at speeds that would have seemed impossible to his ancestors. The year was 2347, and humanity owned the galaxy, or at least the parts that mattered. 40 star systems flew the flag of Earth, and that number grew every month. Jack had spent 20 years making sure of that. He was a tall man with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen 100 worlds kneel before human might. Today he felt particularly satisfied because the Terran Council had just approved his proposal to expand into the Outer Veil, a region of space that had remained mysteriously untouched by any of the major powers. Commander Lisa Grant sat at her station reviewing the latest intelligence reports, and something troubled her. Lisa was 32 years old with sharp features and sharper instincts. She had joined the fleet because she believed in humanity's destiny among the stars, but lately, that belief had started to crack. The reports she read came from intercepted communications of the Kelthera, one of the oldest alien species humanity had encountered. The Kelthera had been a mighty civilization once, but now they lived in scattered refugee camps on the edges of human space. Their messages spoke of warnings and ancient protocols and something they called the Guardians. Lisa highlighted a particular phrase that appeared in dozens of transmissions. The Forbidden Zone must remain sealed. President Carl Bennett addressed the Terran Council from his office on Earth, and his words were broadcast to every human colony across the explored galaxy. Carl was a politician who had built his career on the promise of endless expansion and prosperity. He was 50 years old with perfect teeth and a smile that won elections. Today he announced that humanity would be sending an expedition into the Outer Veil, despite the concerns raised by some of the more cautious council members. The region contained vast amounts of rare minerals and energy sources that could power human civilization for centuries. Some alien species had placed warning beacons around the area, but Carl dismissed these as attempts to hoard resources. Humanity would not be intimidated by superstition. Lisa brought her concerns to Jack during the evening briefing. She showed him the Kelthera communications and explained that 17 different alien languages all carried the same warning about the Outer Veil. The messages were old, some of them thousands of years old, and they all said the same thing. Turn back. This is sacred ground. Do not disturb what sleeps here. Jack listened patiently because he respected Lisa's analytical mind, but ultimately he shook his head. He told her that humanity had heard warnings before from species that wanted to keep their advantages. The galaxy belonged to the bold, and Earth had proven itself the boldest of all. Lisa pressed the issue and asked what if the warnings were real, and what if they were protecting everyone from something dangerous. Jack smiled and told her that nothing in the galaxy was more dangerous than an angry human fleet. Captain Ryan Hughes received his orders 3 days later. Ryan was 38 years old and commanded the exploration vessel Swift Arrow. He had discovered 6 habitable worlds in his career, and his name was known across human space. His new mission was to lead the first expedition into the Outer Veil and catalog whatever resources existed there. His science officer, Dr. Amy Patterson, was excited about the assignment because the region showed unusual energy readings that suggested advanced technology. Amy was 29 and brilliant, the kind of scientist who saw puzzles everywhere and couldn't rest until she solved them. She told Ryan that whatever created those energy signatures was far beyond current human understanding and might represent a breakthrough in physics. The Swift Arrow jumped into the Outer Veil on a Tuesday morning Earth time. Ryan brought 3 other ships with him for support and security. Almost immediately, they encountered the warning beacons. The beacons were ancient devices that floated in space, broadcasting their messages in an endless loop. Amy recorded 17 different languages, and when the ship's computer translated them, they all said variations of the same thing. Turn back, sacred ground. Do not proceed. Sealed by the Accord. Ryan reported the findings to Fleet Command and waited for orders. Jack Morrison reviewed the data and consulted with President Bennett. They agreed that the warnings were likely meant to scare away competitors and ordered Ryan to proceed. 2 days into the Outer Veil, they found it. Amy was the first to see it on the sensors, and she called Ryan to the science station with trembling hands. A massive ring structure orbited a dying red star. The ring was easily 1,000 kilometers in diameter and radiated power signatures that made their instruments scream. It was clearly artificial and clearly ancient beyond measure. The surface was covered in symbols that Amy recognized from the warning beacons. She began cataloging everything while Ryan maneuvered the swift arrow closer. The other 3 ships in his small fleet spread out to scan from different angles. Amy worked for 18 hours straight translating what she could. The symbols told a story of something imprisoned within the ring, something called the hunger that had nearly destroyed all life in the galaxy millions of years ago. An alliance of ancient species called the Accord had sacrificed their civilizations to build this prison, and others like it. The protocols were clear. Never open the seals, never breach the structure, never disturb what was contained. Amy brought this information to Ryan and begged him to retreat. She said they were standing at the door of something that terrified civilizations far more advanced than humanity. Ryan contacted Jack Morrison and sent all of Amy's findings. He recommended immediate withdrawal and proposed that humanity convene a council with the remaining elder species to understand the situation better. Jack reviewed the data with his staff and with President Bennett. They saw things differently. The ring represented technology beyond human understanding, and whoever controlled it would have unimaginable power. The warnings might be real, but that only meant the prize was worth the risk. Besides, humanity had not become masters of the galaxy by running from challenges. Jack ordered Ryan to probe the structure and find a way inside. Ryan Hughes stood on his bridge and looked at the faces of his crew. They trusted him to keep them safe, and he had always done that. But orders were orders, and the chain of command had to be respected. He gave the command to launch a probe, and the probe flew toward the ancient ring, carrying humanity's hubris with it through the empty dark. The probe touched the surface of the ring, and immediately the entire structure lit up with brilliant white light that hurt to look at even through filtered screens. Ryan Hughes grabbed the arms of his command chair as every alarm on the swift arrow began screaming at once. Amy Patterson shouted readings from her station, but her voice was barely audible over the chaos. The energy readings had spiked to levels that shouldn't have been possible, and something was scanning them, something vast and ancient and aware. A voice filled every speaker on every ship in Ryan's small fleet. It spoke in perfect English, which should have been impossible, because English had only existed for a few thousand years, and this thing was millions of years old. The voice called itself the Warden, and it demanded that humanity withdraw immediately. The Warden explained that this place was sealed by the sacrifice of countless civilizations, and the seals must not be broken. Ryan tried to respond and asked for peaceful dialogue, but the Warden simply repeated its demand. Leave now or face consequences beyond human understanding. 60,000 kilometers away aboard the Valiant Dawn, Jack Morrison watched the events unfold through the data link. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Ben Carter, stood ready at the weapons station waiting for orders. Lisa Grant had been monitoring the situation from her post, and she spoke up immediately. She told Jack that the Warden was clearly protecting something important, and they should respect that and withdraw. Jack considered her words, but ultimately he saw the situation differently. The Warden had made demands, and demands were a form of negotiation. In Jack's experience, negotiation only happened when someone had something to protect. He ordered Ben Carter to target the ring structure with a warning shot. Ben Carter was 26 years old and had never questioned an order in his life. His father had served in the fleet and his grandfather before that. The military was in his blood and discipline was everything, but as his fingers moved toward the firing controls, he hesitated for just a moment. Something about the Warden's voice had carried weight and truth. He glanced at Lisa Grant and saw her shaking her head, but Jack Morrison repeated the order and Ben did his duty. The Valiant Dawn fired a single plasma torpedo that streaked across space and struck the ring. Structure dead center, the torpedo exploded, harmlessly against some kind of energy barrier that flared bright blue and absorbed the impact completely. For 3 seconds, nothing happened, and Ben allowed himself to hope that maybe the warning shot would be enough to prove humanity's seriousness. Then the Warden responded. 3 ships in Ryan's fleet went dark instantly. Their engines stopped, their weapons went offline, their life support switched to backup power. The crews were unharmed, but their vessels were effectively dead in space. The Warden spoke again and said humanity had been given a chance and wasted it. On Earth, President Carl Bennett convened an emergency meeting in the Situation Room deep beneath the Capitol building. General Frank Ellis attended along with diplomat Claire Murphy and a dozen advisors. Carl paced the room while watching the live feed from the outer veil. Frank was a military man who had spent 40 years learning how to win wars, and he saw the situation as a test of human resolve. He argued that showing weakness now would embolden every alien species that resented human dominance. Claire Murphy disagreed strongly. She had spent her career building relationships with alien civilizations, and she understood that not every conflict could be solved with force. She begged Carl to authorize a withdrawal and open diplomatic channels with the Warden. Carl listened to both arguments and made his decision. He authorized Jack Morrison to bring the full weight of the Terran fleet to bear on the situation. Humanity could not afford to look weak in front of the entire galaxy. If the Warden wanted to make demands, then humanity would show it what real power looked like. Claire Murphy gathered her things and walked out of the meeting. She submitted her resignation before she reached her office. Inside the ring structure, Ryan Hughes and Amy Patterson found themselves in a nightmare. When the Warden had disabled their ship, some kind of tractor beam had pulled the swift arrow through an opening in the ring's surface. Now they drifted through enormous corridors filled with technology that hurt to look at. Amy had her scanner out and was recording everything, but her hands shook so badly she could barely hold the device. Ryan tried to contact the fleet, but communications were blocked. They were alone inside an alien prison surrounded by warnings they couldn't read. Amy found a chamber that contained holographic records. The holograms activated when she approached and began playing automatically. They showed images of the galaxy as it had been millions of years ago, when dozens of advanced civilizations had flourished. Then the images showed something else, something that existed partially outside normal space. The ancient records called it the Hunger, and showed how it had consumed entire star systems, feeding on all forms of energy, including the life force of organic beings. The civilizations of the Accord had united to stop it, and after a war that lasted 10,000 years, they had succeeded in imprisoning it. The cost had been unimaginable. The Accord civilizations had poured all their resources into building 7 prison structures across the galaxy. They had sacrificed their technology, their cultures, their futures to ensure the Hunger remained sealed. The Wardens were artificial intelligences created to guard the prisons forever. The protocols existed to make absolutely certain that no one would ever accidentally release what had been locked away. Amy watched the records with growing horror and realized what humanity was about to do. She managed to access the Swift Arrow's emergency transmitter and sent a message to the fleet. Her voice was desperate as she explained what she had learned. The ring was not a treasure to be claimed, but a lock on a door that must never be opened. She begged them to stand down and retreat immediately. Ryan added his voice to hers and used every bit of authority he possessed to order the fleet to withdraw. But 60,000 kilometers away, Jack Morrison looked at the message and saw only what he expected to see. Jack told his bridge crew that Ryan and Amy had been compromised. The Warden had clearly gotten to them somehow and was using them to spread fear. He could not afford to trust their judgment anymore. Lisa Grant stood up from her station and said she believed Ryan and Amy completely. She said the evidence was overwhelming and humanity was making a terrible mistake. Jack looked at her with disappointment and told her she was relieved of duty for insubordination. Security escorted Lisa off the bridge while she shouted warnings that no one wanted to hear. Lieutenant Kevin Ross took Lisa's place at the tactical station. Kevin was 30 years old and ambitious, and he had no intention of throwing away his career over feelings and hunches. Jack Morrison began giving orders to assemble the fleet. Ships jumped into the outer veil from across human space. 70 warships gathered around the Valiant Dawn, representing the might of humanity's military power. Crews went to battle stations and weapons charged. Jack opened a channel to the Warden and told it that humanity did not respond well to threats. Inside the ring structure, Amy Patterson downloaded everything she could from the Accord database. She had minutes at best before the assault began. Ryan stood watch at the chamber entrance with a sidearm that felt completely useless in his hand. Amy's scanner beeped as it finished copying the last files, and she grabbed Ryan's arm. They ran back through the corridors toward where the Swift Arrow had been pulled through the wall. Behind them, the ancient structure began to hum with power, as the Warden prepared to defend itself against an enemy that refused to listen to reason, or wisdom, or fear. Jack Morrison gave the order, and 70 human warships opened fire simultaneously. The space around the ancient ring structure lit up with plasma torpedoes, railgun rounds, and energy beams that could crack planets. The Warden's shields held for the first wave, and the second wave and the third. But humanity had learned to be very good at breaking things, and the combined firepower of an entire fleet was something even ancient technology could not ignore forever. Cracks began to appear in the energy barrier, and those cracks spread like frost across glass. Lieutenant Kevin Ross monitored the weapons array and felt a sick satisfaction with each crack that appeared. He told himself this was necessary and right. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy by backing down from challenges. But somewhere deep in his mind, a voice that sounded like Lisa Grant whispered that pride came before a fall. He pushed that voice away and focused on his duty. Jack Morrison stood at the center of the bridge, looking every bit the conquering admiral that history would remember. He had no doubt that humanity would win this battle just as it had won all the others. The warden made one final attempt to communicate. Its voice came through every speaker on every ship in the fleet, and this time it sounded sad rather than angry. It told humanity that the choice had been made and the consequences would be terrible. It said humanity had doomed itself and countless others. It spoke of the hunger and warned that once released, it could not be stopped by weapons or will. The warden's last words were a simple statement of fact. You have murdered worlds beyond counting and you do not even know it yet. Then the shields failed completely and the ring structure cracked open like an egg. For a moment nothing happened and several crew members allowed themselves to believe the warnings had been exaggerated. Jack Morrison smiled and prepared to order boarding teams to secure the structure. But before he could speak, reality itself seemed to tear open. They came through the breach in the ring like oil spreading across water. The entities existed partially outside normal spacetime, which made them appear as shifting shadows that hurt the eye. They were not alive in any sense that humanity understood. They were not evil or aggressive or even really conscious. They were hungry and everything in the universe was food. The entities swept through the fleet like a wave, and where they passed, ships went dark. Not destroyed or damaged, but drained. Every spark of energy pulled out and consumed. Engines died, computers crashed, life support failed. 40 warships turned into frozen tombs in under 5 minutes. Jack Morrison watched his fleet die around him. The Valiant Dawn was one of the last ships still operational, and only because it had been furthest from the breach. His crew shouted reports that made no sense. The entities could not be targeted because they moved faster than light itself. Weapons passed through them like they were ghosts. Shields were worse than useless because the entities fed on energy, and shields were just more food. Jack finally understood what the warden had tried to tell him, and the understanding came far too late on the planet. New Terra Colony Administrator Paul Henderson sat in his office reviewing supply reports when the emergency broadcast interrupted every screen and speaker in the colony. The message came from Fleet Command, and it was marked Priority Absolute. Paul listened with growing horror as the message explained that something had been released in the outer veil, and all colonies were to begin immediate evacuation procedures. Details were scarce, but the message was clear. Run. Paul had 8,000 colonists under his protection and only enough transport ships for maybe half that number. He called his security chief and his logistics coordinator and began making impossible decisions. Children and essential personnel would go first. Everyone else would have to wait for a second wave that might never come. People began gathering at the spaceport within the hour, and the panic was spreading faster than Paul could contain it. Inside the dying ring structure, Ryan Hughes and Amy Patterson stumbled through corridors that were collapsing around them. The Swift Arrow was still where they had left it, but the tractor beam had released its hold. Ryan fired up the engines on backup power while Amy strapped herself into the science station. The ship lurched forward through the opening in the ring's surface just as the entire structure began to tear itself apart. Behind them, the hunger poured out into open space. Amy worked frantically to organize the data she had stolen from the Accord archives. She had everything: the complete history of the hunger, the specifications for the prison network, and most importantly, the instructions for how to reseal the entities if they ever escaped. But the instructions were written in languages humanity had never bothered to learn, languages spoken by species humanity had conquered or dismissed as primitive. The Kelthera language was there, and the Vorn mathematical symbols and the harmonic codes of the Silicate Collective. Amy realized with sick clarity that humanity could not save itself alone. Ryan pushed the Swift Arrow to maximum speed, heading back toward human space. He tried to contact the fleet but got only static and automated distress beacons. 40 ships dead, thousands of crew members gone, and the hunger was spreading. Amy pulled up a projection showing the entity's likely path, and both of them went silent. The nearest colony was New Terra, and the hunger would reach it in approximately 6 hours. Ryan diverted course to intercept and tried not to think about whether they would arrive in time. The entities reached the outer veil's edge and found the Kelthera refugee station sanctuary. 2,000 Kelthera lived there in the ruins of what had once been a mighty civilization. They had been defeated by humanity decades ago and pushed to the edges of space where resources were scarce. Now they watched on their sensors as the hunger approached. The elder Kelthera named Vex stood in the station's command center and prepared her people for the end. She had known this day would come eventually. The humans had been warned, and humans never listened. The hunger swept through Sanctuary in minutes. The Kelthera did not even try to fight because they knew the old stories. They died with dignity while Vex transmitted a final message to anyone who might hear. Humanity has doomed us all. The ancient evil is free, and there is no one left who remembers how to stop it. Then the transmission ended and Sanctuary went dark. President Carl Bennett sat in the Situation Room receiving reports from across human space. The news got worse with each update. The outer colonies were reporting strange sensor readings. Fleet Command had lost contact with 40 warships. General Frank Ellis recommended mobilizing every military asset humanity possessed. Carl approved the order and then sat back in his chair feeling very old. Claire Murphy's resignation letter sat on his desk and he read it again. She had been right and he had been wrong, and now the cost of that mistake was becoming clear. Jack Morrison managed to get the Valiant Dawn and 29 other surviving ships away from the breach point. They jumped back to the nearest human outpost to regroup and try to understand what they were facing. Lisa Grant was brought back to the bridge and Jack offered no apologies, but she could see the defeat in his eyes. She took her station and began analyzing what little data they had. The entities moved faster than anything humanity had ever seen. They consumed all forms of energy, and most terrifying of all, they were multiplying. Each entity that fed seemed to spawn others. New Terra's spaceport descended into chaos. Paul Henderson tried to maintain order, but people were desperate and afraid. Fights broke out over seats on transport ships. Families were torn apart. Paul did his best, but 8,000 people could not be saved with the resources available. He made the call to begin launching ships even though they were only half full, because half saved was better than none. The first transport lifted off carrying 400 colonists toward the questionable safety of Earth. Ryan Hughes and Amy Patterson arrived at New Terra with 3 hours to spare before the hunger. Ryan broadcast a system-wide evacuation order, and Amy transmitted everything she had learned to every database she could reach. If they died, at least the knowledge would survive. They landed at the spaceport and helped Paul coordinate the evacuation. Amy pulled aside every scientist on the planet and explained what was coming. Some of them broke down in tears. Others got to work trying to find solutions with the little time they had left. The hunger arrived at New Terra exactly when Amy's calculations predicted. Ryan stood on the spaceport tarmac and watched the sky fill with darkness that was not darkness, movement that was not movement, and hunger that could never be satisfied. The last transport ship lifted off carrying Paul Henderson and the final group of evacuees. Ryan and Amy stayed behind with 200 volunteers who had refused to leave their homes. They watched the hunger descend, and in those final moments Amy squeezed Ryan's hand and said she was sorry they had not done more. Ryan said they had done everything they could, and sometimes that was not enough. Then the hunger reached them and New Terra fell silent. President Carl Bennett stood before the Terran Council and the cameras that broadcast his words to 40 star systems and admitted the truth. Humanity had made a terrible mistake and unleashed something ancient and unstoppable. New Terra was gone. Sanctuary was gone. 7 colonies had gone silent in the past week, and the hunger showed no signs of slowing. Carl's voice shook as he authorized General Frank Ellis to mobilize every military asset humanity possessed, but both of them knew conventional weapons were useless. The entities could not be destroyed, and every attempt to fight them only resulted in more death. Lisa Grant worked 20-hour days aboard the Valiant Dawn trying to decode the information Amy Patterson had transmitted before New Terra fell. The data was complete but maddeningly difficult to understand. The Accord had left instructions for resealing the hunger, but those instructions required knowledge that humanity did not possess. The Kelthera understood the linguistic patterns. The Vorn knew how to manipulate the energy frequencies. The Silicate Collective had the computational power to coordinate a galaxy-wide response. Lisa realized with bitter irony that humanity needed the help of every species. It had spent decades conquering and marginalizing. Jack Morrison volunteered to lead diplomatic missions to the surviving alien civilizations. It was the least he could do after what his arrogance had unleashed. Lisa tried to tell him it was not his fault alone, that the entire human leadership shared the blame, but Jack would not hear it. He took Lieutenant Kevin Ross with him, and they began the humiliating work of begging for help from species that had every reason to refuse. Their first stop was the Kelthera homeworld, where the surviving elders lived in underground cities beneath a surface humanity had stripped of resources. Elder Vex met them in a chamber lit by bioluminescent fungi. She was ancient beyond human understanding, and her eyes held the weight of watching her civilization die. Jack began to speak, but Vex raised a hand to silence him. She told him that the Kelthera had known this day would come because they had seen humanity's path and recognized it. Pride before wisdom, conquest before understanding. The Kelthera had tried to warn humanity about the forbidden zones, but humans had dismissed their words as superstition. Now Vex asked a simple question. Why should the Kelthera help humanity after everything humans had done to them? Jack had no good answer. He could only tell the truth. If the hunger was not stopped, it would consume everything, human and Kelthera alike. The choice was not between helping humanity or letting humanity suffer. The choice was between survival and extinction. Kevin Ross stood beside Jack and added his own plea. He spoke of his sister who lived on one of the colonies in the hunger's path, and how she had 3 children who had never hurt anyone. He said he understood if the Kelthera wanted revenge, but begged them not to take it on innocent children. Vex listened to both humans and then dismissed them to deliberate with the other elders. On Earth, General Frank Ellis struggled to maintain order as panic spread through the population. People demanded answers and accountability. Riots broke out in major cities. Colony ships departed Earth overloaded with refugees heading for the farthest edges of explored space. Frank deployed military forces to restore order, but half his soldiers deserted to try to save their own families. The Terran Council convened emergency sessions but accomplished nothing except pointing fingers and assigning blame. Carl Bennett's government was collapsing, and everyone knew it. Lieutenant Ben Carter sat in a medical facility receiving treatment for what the doctors called acute stress disorder. He was the man who had fired the first shot at the warden on Jack Morrison's orders. That single shot had started everything. Ben could not sleep because every time he closed his eyes he saw the darkness pouring out of the broken ring. He could not eat because food tasted like ashes. The doctors gave him medication, but it did nothing to ease the guilt that ate at him from the inside. His father visited once and told him he had only followed orders, but Ben knew that following orders was not always enough. Lisa Grant received a transmission from the Vorn collective consciousness. The Vorn were energy beings who existed in a state between matter and pure thought. They had watched humanity's expansion with concern and had retreated to the far reaches of space to avoid conflict. Now they offered their help, but with conditions. Humanity would have to surrender all claims to Vorn space and promise never to return. They would have to release the Vorn prisoners held in human research facilities, and they would have to acknowledge in a formal treaty that the Vorn were equals, not subjects. Lisa transmitted the demands to President Bennett, who approved them immediately. Pride no longer mattered when extinction was the alternative. The Silicate Collective responded through their diplomatic channels. The collective was a hive mind of crystalline beings who thought in mathematical harmonies humanity could barely comprehend. They had resisted human expansion fiercely and lost 3 of their colony worlds in the process. Their conditions were even harsher than the Vorn demands. They wanted reparations for the destroyed colonies. They wanted human mining operations removed from all Silicate territory, and they wanted 2 seats on any new galactic governing body that might be formed. President Bennett approved these demands as well, and began to understand that the old empire was truly dead. Elder Vex finally sent word that the Kelthara would help. They would provide linguistic expertise and knowledge of the ancient protocols. But they too had conditions. The Kelthera refugees scattered across human space would be given ships and supplies to return to their homeworld. Humanity would pay for the ecological restoration of the Kelthera home system, and the Kelthera would have veto power over any future human expansion into regions marked as sacred or protected by ancient civilizations. Carl Bennett signed the agreement with shaking hands and wondered what would be left of humanity when this was over. Lisa Grant brought together the first multi-species research team in galactic history. Kelthera linguists worked alongside Vorn energy specialists and Silicate computational experts, with humans serving as coordinators rather than leaders. The work was agonizingly slow because even with everyone cooperating, the Accord's technology was far beyond current understanding. They learned that 7 ancient structures remained scattered across the galaxy, and each one could be used to project a containment field. If all 7 were activated simultaneously, the hunger could be pulled back into its prison. The problem was activation. Each structure required a living consciousness to interface directly with systems that were never designed for organic beings. The Accord records were clear about this. Someone would have to enter the heart of each structure and manually initialize the protocols. The process required the volunteer to essentially merge their mind with ancient machinery, and the strain would be fatal. Every volunteer would die, but the alternative was letting the hunger consume the galaxy. Lisa read this information to the assembled team, and for a long moment no one spoke. Jack Morrison was the first to volunteer. He stood up in the briefing room and said he had started this nightmare, so he should help end it. Kevin Ross stood immediately after and said he would go with Jack. Then others began volunteering. Pilot Nicole Barnes, who had evacuated 6,000 people from Helios Prime before it fell. Engineer Danny Cole, who had designed half the ships in the human fleet. Xenobiologist Maria Santos, who had spent her career studying alien cultures and advocating for peaceful coexistence. Each of them understood the price, and each of them chose to pay it. Lisa Grant was the last to stand. Her colleagues tried to talk her out of it, but she refused to listen. She had been warning humanity about this path for years, and no one had listened. She had tried to stop the expedition to the Outer Veil and been dismissed. She had been right about everything, and it had not mattered. Now she could actually make a difference, and she would not waste the opportunity. President Bennett called her personally and tried to forbid her from going, but Lisa reminded him that she was not asking for permission. She was informing him of her decision. The 7 volunteers were each assigned to one of the ancient structures, along with mixed crews of humans and aliens. The Kelthera provided guidance on how to approach the site safely. The Vorn offered protection using their energy manipulation abilities. Dozens of other species contributed what they could. It was the first time in recorded history that so many civilizations had worked together toward a common goal, and the cooperation was born entirely from desperation and shared guilt. Lisa Grant stood in the briefing room one last time before departing. For her assigned structure, she looked at the faces of the other volunteers and saw her own determination reflected back at her. Jack Morrison gave a short speech about duty and sacrifice, but Lisa barely heard it. She was thinking about Earth and the children who would inherit whatever galaxy survived this catastrophe. She hoped they would learn from this mistake. She hoped they would be better than their parents had been. Then the briefing ended, and the volunteers departed to their ships and their destinies and their certain deaths. The journey to the ancient structures took weeks, and during that time, the hunger continued to spread. 15 colonies fell silent, bringing the total to 22. Millions of people evacuated toward Earth or the core systems that still seemed safe. Refugee ships crowded every spaceport and orbital station. The galaxy watched and waited to see if humanity's desperate plan would work, or if this was merely the beginning of the end for all organic life. Jack Morrison traveled with a crew of 12, including 3 Kelthera advisors and 2 foreign energy specialists. His structure was located in a dead system where 3 planets had been consumed by their dying star millions of years ago. The ring hung in space, surrounded by debris and radiation that would have killed an unshielded human in seconds. Jack spent the journey learning what he could about the activation process from the Kelthera, but they could only tell him so much. The Accord had designed the structures to be intuitive, for those with the right mental flexibility, and Jack would have to trust his instincts once he was inside. Lieutenant Kevin Ross approached his structure, in the remains of what had once been a thriving star cluster. Dozens of dead worlds drifted in the darkness, and the Kelthera explained these had been the home systems of Accord species who had sacrificed everything to build the prison network. Kevin recorded messages for his family and friends, knowing they would be delivered after he was gone. He told his sister to raise her children with wisdom and humility. He told his father that following orders was important, but understanding why orders were given mattered more. Then he sealed the messages and prepared to do what needed to be done. Pilot Nicole Barnes flew her ship through an asteroid field to reach her assigned structure. Nicole was 41 years old and had been flying since she was 16. She had evacuated more people during the crisis than anyone else in the fleet and saved thousands of lives. Now she would save billions. Her crew was the smallest of the 7 teams, just 5 people including herself. They did not need many because the structure was automated, and once Nicole interfaced with it, the others would only need to monitor her vital signs and record the process for future reference. Nicole checked her instruments and guided her ship into the docking port that the Kelthera had identified. Engineer Danny Cole reached his structure after a narrow escape from the hunger itself. His ship's sensors had detected the entities just 4 hours behind him, and Danny had pushed his engines beyond rated capacity to stay ahead. The structure he approached was different from the others, built more recently by Accord standards, which meant only a few 100,000 years old. Danny's engineering expertise would be crucial here because this structure had sustained damage over the millennia and might not activate properly. He had to repair ancient systems using tools and knowledge cobbled together from a dozen different species. It took him 3 days, but finally the structure was ready. Xenobiologist Maria Santos studied her assigned structure with wonder, even knowing she would die inside it. Maria had devoted her life to understanding alien cultures, and here was the pinnacle of ancient cooperation. The structure's walls were covered in languages and symbols from species long extinct. Maria walked the corridors with her Kelthera guide and learned the names of civilizations that had given everything so that future generations might live. She felt honored to join their sacrifice and hoped her death would mean something. Lisa Grant arrived at her structure last because it was located farthest from human space. The journey gave her time to think about everything that had led to this moment. She thought about the warnings humanity had ignored and the species they had trampled. She thought about Jack Morrison's arrogance and Carl Bennett's ambition, and her own failure to stop them. But mostly she thought about the future and what humanity might become if they survived this. The species that emerged from this crisis would be humbled, and that humbling might save them from their own worst instincts. The activation sequence was coordinated by the Silicate Collective, whose computational abilities allowed them to synchronize across galactic distances. All 7 volunteers would interface with their structures simultaneously, and the containment field would activate as one. If even a single volunteer failed, the entire plan would collapse and the hunger would continue spreading. President Carl Bennett watched from Earth as the countdown began. General Frank Ellis stood beside him along with representatives from every species that had contributed to the effort. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Jack Morrison was the first to enter his structure's core. The chamber was vast and filled with machinery that pulsed with barely contained power. In the center was a platform, and on that platform was a device that looked disturbingly organic. Jack approached it with his Kelthera advisor Vex, who had insisted on accompanying him this far. She told him to place his hands on the device and open his mind. The structure would do the rest. Jack thanked her for everything the Kelthera had done and apologized for everything humanity had taken. Vex simply nodded and stepped back. Jack placed his hands on the device and screamed as ancient technology flooded his consciousness. Kevin Ross activated his structure seconds later. The sensation was like being dissolved and rebuilt atom by atom. He could feel the structure's systems connecting to his nervous system and using his mind as a bridge to the physical world. Through the pain, he could sense the hunger out in the galaxy and feel the boundaries of the containment field beginning to form. He held on and focused everything he had on maintaining the connection, even as his body began to fail. Nicole Barnes felt her heart stop almost immediately after interface. The structure was pulling energy from her life force to power its systems. She had known this would happen, but the reality was more intense than any simulation. Her crew shouted readings that she could no longer hear. Her vision went dark, but somehow she could still see through the structure's sensors. She watched the containment field spread outward and smiled with lips that no longer worked. Danny Cole's repairs held but barely. His structure stuttered and threatened to fail, but Danny forced more of himself into the connection. He had built things his entire life, and now he was building something that would last forever. His consciousness merged with ancient circuits, and he became part of the machine. The distinction between Danny and the structure blurred and finally disappeared. The containment field stabilized, and Danny Cole ceased to exist as an individual. Maria Santos experienced the deaths of the Accord as her structure accessed those ancient memories. She felt millions of beings choosing sacrifice over survival, and understood finally what courage really meant. Her own death seemed small compared to theirs, but it was her death and her choice, and she gave it freely. The structure accepted her offering, and the containment field grew stronger. The sixth volunteer, whose name was Patrick Hayes, held his connection longer than anyone expected. Patrick was 63 years old and had joined the mission because his children had died on New Terra. He had nothing left to lose and everything to give. His structure was the oldest and most damaged, but Patrick's stubborn refusal to die early kept it functioning. He lasted an extra 40 seconds beyond what the projections predicted, and those 40 seconds made all the difference. Lisa Grant was the last to die. She felt the other 6 structures activate and knew her colleagues had succeeded. Now it was her turn. The ancient device pulled at her consciousness, and Lisa did not resist. She had spent her career warning humanity about consequences, and now she was experiencing the ultimate consequence, but she also felt something else, something the Accord had built into the structures. Hope. They had believed that future generations would be better, and that belief had sustained them through their sacrifice. Lisa clung to that hope as her body failed and her consciousness scattered. Her last thought was a simple prayer that humanity would finally learn. The containment field activated at full power and swept across the galaxy faster than light. The hunger was pulled inexorably back toward the 7 structures and the prison that had held it for millions of years. The entities fought against the pull, but ancient technology proved stronger than ancient evil. Within hours, the last of the hunger was sealed away and new locks were put in place, locks that could not be broken by force or ignorance. The galaxy held its breath and then slowly began to breathe again. President Carl Bennett resigned 3 days after the containment succeeded. He had saved humanity, but at a cost he could not bear. Claire Murphy returned from her exile and accepted the position of interim president. Her first act was to dissolve the Terran Council and propose a new governing structure that included representatives from every spacefaring species. The proposal passed unanimously because no one wanted to see humanity or any other species make the same mistakes again. The memorial service was held in orbit above Earth. Representatives from 40 species attended, including Elder Vex and the Vorn Collective and ambassadors from the Silicate Collective. 7 empty chairs sat on the stage representing the volunteers who had given everything. President Murphy spoke about sacrifice and humility and the price of arrogance.